Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. We're glad you're here. And now our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
It's Dr. Mike Patterson, your host of the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about what it takes to be a great leader and how to build a great team. Today, my guest is Art Jackson. Art is a professional speaker, executive coach, and the president of Eagle's Nest Performance Management. He's a recognized expert in the areas of leadership, performance improvement, and interpersonal skills. Art is the originator of the purpose-centered leadership system that has been used to improve performance in many facets of public and private life. Art is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. Then he served as an active duty Army officer before beginning his civilian career. So we thank Art for his service. We always do that on Mission First People Always. All our veterans deserve our gratitude. Art then went on to have a successful career as an engineer, and now he spends his time coaching executive level leaders and speaking at conferences and doing keynotes, and he's just a great speaker. In fact, the reason I'm talking to Art today is because a mutual friend recommended it. And here's what my friend said about Art. And this guy works in a large government agency, and he said this: we've had lots of speakers come into our organization, but Art was by far the best. He was informative and entertaining. After a few minutes, I knew there was something special about it. So Art, welcome to the Mission First People Always Great Leaders, Great Teams podcast. I'm glad you're here.
Mike, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
You know, Art, we're going to talk today about this topic of up leadership, and we need up leadership, especially when we have challenging bosses. Yeah. Now, I was going to call them lousy bosses, but challenging sounds a little more politically correct.
It does.
It's kinder, it's gentler, and perhaps a little more professional way of saying that some bosses are really bad. And since we'd always like to keep it real on the Mission First People Always podcast, it's important that we talk about what we can do to help our team, our colleagues, our organization, and ourselves when we run into one of those really bad bosses.
Yeah.
So let's start with some basics. How do you define a lousy boss, or a challenging boss, I should say? And what are some of the characteristics they tend to display?
You know, most of the time when you're really thinking about a challenging boss, you're thinking about somebody that is really not a leader. You know, we spend a lot of time, and we have the idea that if someone is good at some technical skill, then that means they'd be good at leading other people in that technical skill. But I like to go using the definition of H. Norman Schwarzkopf that he got first year that he was at the academy. And his definition of leadership is that leadership is the art, the talent, the skill, the ability to get others to do those things that they do not naturally or normally want to do. Right. If you look at those four components, art, talent, skill, and ability, you can understand that everybody just can't have all four of those. Right? If you know, skill and ability can be trained, we can learn those either through formal education or through experience. But art and talent, you either showed up with it or you didn't. It is always amazing to me, but it's been less than 10 years that we have really started to look at the emotionally intelligent part of leadership. So I've got to have some emotional intelligence about myself. I've got to know who I am. But I also have to have the ability to figure that out in other people. A lot of times we have individuals that are subject matter experts in something. That's their bent. That's what they love doing. That's the direction that they lean in. But they've gotten to the place in the organization that we believe they ought to now be in charge of people. And if I don't have that art and talent part of it, it's just going to make it difficult for me. Now, we can teach some of the basic strategies, some of the basic principles of leadership, but you have to have a feel for people. And Mike, to be honest, a little bit more than that, you got to really love people. It is, you got to have a feeling for them, and you got to want the very best for them. You got to, I think that the title of your podcast is so good, Mission First people always, and we debated that all the time in the military, which is most important, the mission or the people performing the mission. Mission first, people always. Well, it kind of gets down to sometimes the mission is going to be the most important thing. Making sure I get all the to-dos done, attacking my objectives, making sure that I'm hitting my goals. But sometimes the people are more important. See, if I've got someone in my organization and she just lost a child, he just went through a divorce, they just lost a parent or a significant other, then we kind of get ourselves to the point of, well, right now, can they bring their A game to the table? Right now, can they be everything that they have the possibility of being? And the answer is probably no. And if I, as the leader, if my attitude is, I don't care what happened in your personal life, I don't care what your baggage is right now, I want my 15 widgets a month. Not only do I lose them, but all of their peers and their subordinates that are watching that action, each and every one of them will decide, you know what? He just doesn't care about us. All he wants is those 15 widgets. And when your people start to believe that the mission is more important than the people, that's when they start to hold back.
Yeah, I always say that people in performance need to be held in balance.
Yes.
And if that equation gets out of balance for an extended period of time, you're going to struggle.
Yeah.
So I like what you were saying, Art, about how people get to a certain point because they're a subject matter expert. They're technically really good at their job. They're the best IT guy in the organization. So we promote them into a leadership position. And some people may not be prepared for that because they weren't trained in any leadership skills, or they're not inclined toward people, as you suggested. So we get these lousy leaders, or people who are developing as leaders. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. They're on a journey and they're developing as leaders, but they've got a long way to go to get where they need to be. So we need to practice what you call up leadership. How would you define up leadership?
When you're in a leadership position, you're going to lead in three directions all the time. It doesn't matter where you are in the food chain, on the corporate ladder or anything, you lead in three directions all the time. You lead down. Those are your subordinates. To be honest, those are the easiest ones for you to lead because you've got some formal authority over them. You decide how much more money they're going to make, and you decide their working conditions and everything. So they're the easiest ones to lead. And then you have your peers. These are the ones that are the same place in the organization that you are, but they could be in your organization or they're in a different organization. Now, to lead them, I've got to have some influence, and I've got to be the kind of person that they want to support. And even more difficult than them is when you're leading the boss. Now, it's not just your direct boss, but it's your boss and your boss's peers. And there, not only do I have to have influence, not only do I have to be likable, but I've got to have some tact. A lot of times when it comes to leading your boss, you have to lead them without them knowing that you're leading them. As a matter of fact, that should be the farthest thing from their mind, that you're actually leading them. So you spend a lot of time getting them to do things by asking them questions. Ma'am, is that the best way for us to go after this particular objective? Or would you consider something that moves along a little different path? That requires some tact. And that's why everybody can't do it. If my boss thinks that I am overriding him or her, I'm going to get even more pushback. So what I want to do is to make sure that I'm speaking to them in such a fashion that they always understand that they're higher than me in the food chain. Mike, I'll give you a good example. I am a minister at the church that I'm at, and I've got a senior pastor. And when I first started working at that church, I gave him the nickname Boss. And when I write something, hey boss, if I see him on a Sunday morning, hey boss, how you doing? As a matter of fact, and you probably know from the military, a lot of times whoever's in command, you call them the old man.
Mm-hmm.
And we went on a retreat once, and all of us are in this huge cabin, and each of us had individual rooms in this cabin. And I was out talking to one of the other guys in the main area one morning, and I didn't know it, but the senior pastor was listening from his room. And he finally came out and he looked at me, he said, "Hang on a minute, who is the old man?" And I said, "Oh, that's you." and he goes, "But I'm younger than you." I'm going, "Yes, sir, I understand you're younger than me, but whoever's in command, that's always the old man. You're the old man." And he goes, "Okay." And we all had a big laugh about that. With him, I think he finds a lot of value in some of the things that I'm suggesting, but he's got to always be the one that makes the decision. And I have to always make sure that he understands he's the one that's in charge. He's asked me several times, he said, "When I ask you to do something, could you stop saying yes, sir?" I'm going, "No, probably not. Now I can try, but I have been doing this for so long, I doubt I'm going to pull it off effectively."
Exactly.
Yeah.
Hey, Art, I love something you just said, and it made me think about the military version of that example that you just gave. I was in the Army. I was a company commander for a while, and I had a first sergeant. And that first sergeant was my right-hand man. In fact, he did much more than I did with the non-commissioned officers and the soldiers in the company. He called it NCO business. "Sir, I've got this. Don't worry about it." Basically telling me to mind my own business because it was NCO business. He was going to handle it. But those senior non-commissioned officers lead up a lot, whether it's the platoon sergeant with the platoon leader, the first sergeant with his company commander, the sergeant major, command sergeant major with the battalion commander. And that seems to be a model that's worked for a couple of 100 years.
Yes.
What would you say about that?
Well, stop and think about it. And it's not by accident. It is done on purpose. I spent 4 years at West Point. And I mean, that's 47 months of getting ready to go out and be a second lieutenant in the United States Army. And I can remember one of the last classes we had, the instructor said, "When you leave here and get that first platoon, listen to your platoon sergeant."
Mm-hmm.
Listen to your platoon sergeant. Stop and think about it. You're a second lieutenant, which means you've been around for less than a year and a half. And they give you a platoon sergeant that's probably been around for about 15 years. And you're an idiot if you don't pay attention to him when he says, "Sir, let me talk to you about something." You may get to company commander, you're probably a captain. You've been around for about 3 years. And they give you a first sergeant that's been around at that point probably 20 to 25 years. And if you don't pay attention to what Top is trying to tell you about what you should be doing with the troops and with the mission, you're an idiot. You make it to, let's say, battalion commander or squadron commander. You're a lieutenant colonel. You have probably been around for almost 20 years at that point, and they still give you a command sergeant major that's been around for 25 to 30 years. They do that because it's necessary for them to lead up. There has never been a time when I was a company commander, when I was a platoon leader, where I didn't have one of those senior NCOs that would go, "Hey, I need to talk with you about something, sir." And I always took the time to go, "Hey, let's roll off behind the tanks here and talk for a little while." And some of those discussions, Mike, weren't the easiest in the world. I can remember my first sergeant cussing me out behind the tank line. He always put a "sir" at the end of everything that he said. But he was going, what is going through your head, Lieutenant? You can't do that. And I'm standing there and he goes, "You don't have to stand at attention," because when he started talking, I was almost at attention at that point. He sewed so much into me. When they think you really are trying, and you really do care about the mission, you really do care about the troops, you really do care about what you're trying to accomplish, they will sew into you. And you can tell the officers that had either lousy NCOs or they didn't pay attention to those NCOs. And what ends up happening is that they struggle through their military career. To me, it's the same thing if you're in a corporation or if you're in a government agency. You got people around there that have been there, since the dawn of time, and they know stuff. They know all kinds of stuff, things that you have, as a leader, have never even thought about. And if you just show a little attention, give them a little patience, it is amazing the kind of things that they would tell you. I had when I first got out of the military, I was working for General Dynamics, Land Systems Division. And I used to have this habit once a week of going out into the shop, which was it was like a military motor pool. And I'd go out into the shop and sit on a bleacher and eat lunch. And every now and then I'd see something, I'd get up and I'd go over and I'd talk to some of the mechanics, some of the technicians, and I ask them, hey, what are you doing? Wait a minute, I'm not understanding why you're putting that together like that. And they would go, well, sir, here's what I'm doing. And you'd sit there and you'd listen to them, and I'd always try to throw in a little extra. But what's your name? And okay, so how long you been here? And tell me about your family. What's your family like? And you get all of this information. And when you left, they'd go, he's pretty good. He's in charge, but he really cares about us individually. You want to make sure you do those things. So now, as the one that's leading up, how do you do that with your boss? You should know your boss. You should know, pretty close to what generation they're from, what their family structure is, how many kids do they have? Do the kids play any sports or anything? What school did the boss go to? What do they like doing? What are their hobbies? What do they like doing on the side? What do they do with their weekends when they're not in the office? You should know all of those things, because those are the things that you can use later on in order to help them give a better performance. You should know when your boss has got a major challenge that he or she is dealing with. When you're in their presence, you should feel something's a little off. Something's a little off. And to be able to ask your boss, everything okay today? Are you dealing with anything today? There's that old adage that says, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And to add on to that, once they know how much you care, they really don't even care how much you know. Same thing with your boss. When your boss believes that you care about them as one of the subordinates, it is amazing how much they'll open up, how much they'll tell you, how much they'll indicate, here's what I need from you in order for me to do my very best job.
So it sounds as though that relationship is really nurtured when people are open and transparent and a bit vulnerable. How do people, and some people are just open and willing to share, but some people are a little less willing to share, a little more closed off. How do we find out that sort of information about a boss? Of course, we could ask questions and have a conversation, but there other ways to gather that information that demonstrate we care?
Yeah, one of the things that I've always found is that people are willing to open up to the extent that I'm willing to open up. If they have background information on me, especially my boss, if he or she has background information on me, those things I just mentioned, family structure, hobbies, what do you do with your weekends? Where do you come from? What school did you go to? When they understand those things about me, a lot of times that kind of opens up the door to them doing the same thing. One of my clients is the Virginia Department of Transportation. And I have no idea why, but Virginia Department of Transportation is lousy with VMI grads. And, whenever I'm there and I'm working with them, I'll meet one of them and go, oh, you came from that other military institute, didn't you? And I'll play with them. And it's amazing how much you can find out about. We've got one thing in common. We both went to a military school. We start to get them to open up, and we've got another thing in common. We're both married. Oh, we have another thing in common. We both have kids. And for a lot of people, as long as they know you're not going to judge them for whatever, they're more than willing to open up and talk with you. That goes back to that idea of emotional intelligence, doesn't it?
So, Art, in this context of leading up, have you encountered some leaders who are concerned that you're trying to take over their position, or they don't feel safe to receive that feedback and direction because they're just not secure in themselves, secure in their role. They're playing defense all the time. Do you have any advice if we encounter a situation like that?
Yeah, Mike, to be real honest with you, I wrote the presentation on leading up, managing your boss, because I screwed it up 3 times that I could remember, 3 times really badly. And each and every time it was because I got so focused on the mission, And I had this idea in my mind that my boss is supposed to know more about this mission, how to accomplish this mission, than I'm supposed to know. He's supposed to be better than me because he's higher up the food chain. And for all 3 of those, it was interesting. It was feelings of low self-esteem and feelings of low self-efficacy. So low self-esteem, I don't think very much of myself. And low self-efficacy, I don't believe that I can be successful. And then here I come behind them, and I'm not paying attention to these feelings of low self-esteem. I'm not paying attention to these feelings of low self-efficacy. And instead, I'm just driving. I am not paying enough attention to the human component, the emotional intelligence of that particular individual. And in all 3 of those cases, what I ended up doing was hurting the relationship with the boss. The one that I think I'm most embarrassed about was when I first got out of the military. I had a boss that, and to be real honest, I thought we were friends. And, he and I were pushing. He told me that what he wanted was for us to expand our operation, to increase the number of people we had on the team because we had more requirements. He gave me that for a mission, and I took off on the mission. And as I started getting more and more successful, and more people in the organization knew who I was, and I started getting additional duties, I never bothered to look at him and see that this guy is starting to get a little antsy. He seems to be a little bit bothered. We would go into a staff meeting, and I was one of the junior executives, so I'd sit against the wall. He was up at the table, and there were times when his boss would look over to me at the wall and go, all right, on that project on such and such, where do you see us being able to improve on that? And I never paid attention to the fact that he was over talking my boss because he was at the table. He was over talking him to get to me. So one of the things that I had to develop was just the ability to sit and look at that relationship critically and think about, how do I think this individual, my boss, is feeling right now concerning the 2 of us? Is he comfortable with what I'm doing? And I also learned, if you ask somebody, are they comfortable, and they have feelings of low self-esteem and low self-efficacy, they are going to lie. Yeah, we're good. Everything's great. I'm comfortable with what you're doing. Keep doing it. I have gotten myself to the point that I spend a lot of time paying attention to people's body language, because regardless of what words are coming out, their body generally will tell you the exact story. So if you pay attention to the expression on his or her face, pay attention to how they're folding their arms or crossing their legs in front of you, how fast their foot is twitching under the table. You pay attention to those, you can generally figure out, how is this person feeling right now? So when you think about leadership and leading up to that boss, it almost sounds like you've got to be a leadership expert, a counselor, a coach, a mediator, a priest, a pastor. You got to be all of these things rolled up into one, and that's right on point. That's what leadership is. That's what makes it so difficult. You have to be able to kind of morph into all of these different roles. One morning in my organization, I was sitting in my office, and my boss came in, and he walked into the office. He closed the door behind him, and I looked up and I said, "Yes, sir. Can I help you?" And he just sat down in the chair across on the other side of my desk and said, "I'm in trouble." And my first thought was, well, why are you coming to see me? I'm your subordinate. And he said, I just need to talk for about half an hour. Can we do that? And I'm going, yes, sir. We can talk for half an hour. What he was in trouble about had absolutely nothing to do with our mission in the office. But by then we had built enough of a relationship that he felt, if I can't talk to anybody else about this, I can go talk with him about it. And so he said half an hour. I think we were in there for about 2 hours before we got things straight enough that he could go back.
Well, that says something about you and your character, Art. I mean, for somebody to be willing to come and open up and share, I think that speaks volumes about who you are. Let me switch gears just a little bit because I love this conversation. I love your heart for people and always deferring to the boss, but recognizing that you can influence and guide and you want to be a sincere supporter of the boss. But here's what some person listening to this podcast is undoubtedly thinking. My boss is an idiot. Yes. He or she does not deserve to be there. I would be much better in the position than they are. So why should I help this person perpetuate this horrible mistake that the executives made in putting this person in this role? Why should I drag them across the finish line when they don't deserve to cross the finish line? What would you say to those listeners?
Mike, I'd say because you're not worth your stripes if you don't. They're the ones that have the role. They have the position. And whether whoever put them in that position, because sometimes, people end up in positions because of politics. Sometimes they end up in positions because someone else is trying to do them a favor. Sometimes they end up in those positions because everybody else died and somebody had to do it. So they actually got it. If you are a leader, if you are a professional, then your responsibility is to ensure that team wins to the greatest extent possible. And if that means dragging your boss across the line so that they can make it professionally, that's what you're supposed to be doing. It's been a lot of times when, for me, I can find myself getting a little bent out of shape because I look at it, and I've spent so much time in leadership and so much time in managing projects that I can look at what a boss is doing and going, he is wrong. He should not be in this position. But if I let that thought stay in my head, if I don't run it out of there, if I dwell on that, then I'm not loving them the way I should. It's having a self-sacrificing kind of love for that individual, so that I'm sitting there and saying, okay, he doesn't know how to do this. He's not effective at that. He's afraid of conflict. He makes decisions based on what he thinks others want him to do, not what's best for this mission and these objectives. And all we can really do as leaders, as subordinate leaders, is to try and move them along as slowly and as easily as we can. Now, to the benefit of the organization, we also want to pay attention and try to keep our boss out of problems, out of different challenges. So I'm spending a lot of time with that boss saying, can we talk about that last decision you made and exactly why you did it? And I can't say things like, well, I think that was a wrong decision, because they'll never receive that. Instead, I have to say, okay, that was a possibility, but aren't there other possibilities of things that you could have done in that situation? And then I hope for a better outcome the next time around.
Isn't that the essence of servant leadership, serving others so that they can succeed, so that the organization succeeds, accomplishes its mission? And you used a term, Art, that I want to key off on just real quick here. You said loving your boss, loving colleagues. Where does love fit in the workplace?
I guess that's something else that I picked up in the military. It's the idea of caring about the people that you serve with, your subordinates, caring about your peers, and even caring about your superiors. It is loving them to the extent that you want to see the very best for them. It is it's really, if you stop and think about it, for all of us as human beings, it's what we're called to. We're not called to play whack-a-mole in our vocations. How many to-dos can I knock down before the bell rings? It's really loving people and trying to get the very best for them. I had an example. I was a captain. I was serving in Korea, and I was a battalion staff officer, and we were doing an exercise called Team Spirit. They do it about once a year. And during Team Spirit, we had a unit that had come over from California. And back then we had these M113 armored personnel carriers. And that thing had a bunch of drain plugs in the bottom of it. And when you were traveling on dry land, you had those drain plugs out, because if you spill something inside, it would just wash out through the bottom of the vehicle. You were great. But if you're getting ready to do a water crossing, naturally, you don't want some big holes in the bottom of that vehicle when you're going across water. So one of the things you had to be careful of was to come up to your ready line, stop, have everyone inside, the crew members, put those plugs in, and then continue to cross. We were doing an exercise at night, a lot of pyrotechnics going off. You can hear all of these armored vehicles moving. You can hear people screaming and yelling and everything. And for this unit, they didn't stop at that ready line and put those plugs in. They just kept moving. And so what we had was vehicles that were going across the water and starting to take on water. And just like dominoes, because they're in a straight line, they started to roll over to their right. And we had 3 vehicles that went down, and we lost 4 troops that night. So, you can imagine what that does to the entire operation, but it's a military operation, so it's got to keep going. And we were looking for bodies for weeks, trying to find all of them. I'm sitting in this tent for a briefing, and the division commander came in. And as he came in, of course, all of us came to attention, and he said, "Be seated." So we sat down on those folding chairs, and he's moving up to the front, and he stops at this battalion commander. And he looks at him and says, "You're Colonel so-and-so, right?" And the commander said, "Yes, sir." He goes, "I understand you lost some soldiers the other night." And he said, "Yes, sir, we did." And he said, I can't tell you how much that breaks my heart. When you talk to their families, please make sure that you give them my condolences and tell them that I'm praying for them." And, you could hear a hush in the entire room while he's talking. And this 2-star turns, and he goes to move towards the front again. And he turns back and looks at this colonel and says, "And by the way, what were their names?" And the colonel looked at him and said, "Well, sir, I don't actually know their names. I know what company they were with and everything." And he said, "You lost 4 men almost 3 days ago, and you don't know what their names were?" And he said, "Well, no, sir, but I can get their names for you." And the general looked at him and frowned, and he said, "That's not necessary. Colonel, you're relieved. Get out of my tent." And when a 2-star general tells you that you're relieved of duty, that basically means you just became a civilian. Your career is over with.
Right.
And so he walked out. The colonel gathered his stuff, and he headed out through the flap of the tent. And the general stood there and looked around at each and every one of us. And he said, he should have known the names of those soldiers almost immediately. I will not have a man working for me that does not love his people. As leaders, that's a privilege that we have. We have the privilege of pushing people to get the very best out of them, to help them see that they have the very best in them. But we got to love them at the same time. We got to care about them. And if we don't, we're not worth our stripes.
Wow, what a powerful story. And Art, we could continue talking for hours here, but our time for this episode is about up.
All right.
So, as I always like to do, I want you to give our audience, the folks listening today, 1 or 2 things from our conversation that they might begin doing immediately. Give us one point of application, 1 or 2 points of application, because that's what it's all about. It's not just listening and taking in knowledge. We've got to put what we learn into practice to make it worthwhile. So give us something that we can apply.
I would immediately talk to your boss and ask them the question I've asked bosses ever since I got out of school. What is it we're trying to do here? And when he or she starts to talk, sit there and listen. I guarantee they don't see the world the same way that you see the world. So make sure that you ask that question. What is it that we're trying to do here? After you have done that, make it a routine practice of dropping in on them and continue asking that question, but add another one. How you doing? How are you doing? Oh, I'm doing fine. Okay, doing fine is great. How are you really doing? You should know that. You should have some idea of where they are in all that they're trying to accomplish. I'd recommend that you read a book. One of the best ones is called Lead Your Boss by John Baldoni. John Baldoni. It is a wealth of information on how to lead your boss. The other one is Emotional Intelligence. And right now that book is Emotional Intelligence 2.0. But if you're like me and you like to read through books as quickly as possible, there's another one, Emotional Intelligence for Dummies. It is written on that same for dummies format, which means you got a lot of sort of summary up front, and then you can dive deep into the things. Spend your time thinking about your boss and what he or she is doing and how they're doing it. It is Blaise Pascal, the mathematician and theologian. He said that all a man's ills can be traced to an inability to sit quietly in a room and just think. When you're leading your boss, at some point in time, you need to, on a regular basis, sit someplace, get quiet, and think about the boss. What is she doing? Why is he doing it that way? What are their shortfalls? Try and figure out the places where they're weak. Because for you as a subordinate leader, if they are stumbling in terms of something and you can fill that spot for them, you become incredibly valuable to them. So you got a boss that's really afraid of conflict and you're not afraid of conflict, that's a great place for you to be in the boss's life. Do those things and you will become valuable to the boss and they'll really start to see how much capital you have. Here's the other thing that you want to pay attention to. When I've worked with senior executive officers in the federal government, when I've worked with general officers in the Department of Defense, I have noticed that they generally keep the same people around them for a long time. For most of them, they got to lieutenant colonel and they had certain captains, majors, and lieutenants around them. And they keep those people around them for their entire career. They'll reach back when they get a new position, grab that captain or that major or that lieutenant colonel and, hey, I've got a new command. I want you over here with me, and they'll pull them up. I had one client who was a 2-star at the Pentagon, and this guy had the same admin assistant for about 4 or 5 different postings that he was in. He kept her going from one place to another because he said, she knows me. She understands how I like to work. She takes care of problems for me. Hey, I got to have her around me. If your boss really cares about the organization and they really want to move things forward and address that mission in an effective fashion, having someone like you around them that they know cares about them personally, they will keep you with them. And as they move up the food chain, so will you. So will you.
Art, you've given us some great advice today, and I know you do great work for your clients. How can people get in touch with you? What are you doing? Let's make you available to our audience. How do we reach you?
Thanks so much, Mike. The best way to catch up with me is on my website, artjackson.com. And the website is set up so that you can send me a message straight through the website. I'm also on LinkedIn. You can find me there. And if you just like Facebook, there's a Facebook page out there. You can find me on that one. So either one of those three will make it real easy for you to just do a search for Art Jackson, and I pop up pretty quickly. And if you do have a challenge, if you have something that you'd like to talk about, I'd love to hear from you.
Art, thanks so much for being a guest on the Mission First People Always podcast. I hope you'll come back at some point in the future, because I think we just scratched the surface here today. But that's it for today's episode of Mission First People Always. Great leaders, great teams. If you liked what you heard today, listen to another episode, subscribe. That's even better. And please join us as we have additional great conversations with folks who want to talk about being a great leader and building a great team.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to create a stronger, more people-centric and empowered culture for your organization, visit drmikepatterson.com.